Mark Peterson, a 42-year-old financial consultant, believed he had left the most turbulent chapter of his life behind him. Nearly a decade into his marriage with Laura, they had weathered storms that would have torn other couples apart. At least, that's what Mark told himself. Several years ago, their marriage had been tested by a discovery that shattered Mark's trust. Laura had cheated on him. It was brief, she claimed, a one-time lapse in judgment during a particularly rough patch in their relationship. With tears in her eyes, she had begged for forgiveness, promising to never repeat her mistake. Against his instincts, Mark chose to forgive her, driven by love and a desire to keep their family intact for their 2 children, Emily and Ben. They underwent therapy, built routines to strengthen their bond, and gradually found a semblance of normalcy again. But while time dulled the sharp edges of betrayal, it never truly erased the scar. A family vacation. 8 years after the affair, Mark and Laura decided to take a much-needed family vacation to a coastal resort. With their children now teenagers, it felt like the perfect opportunity to reconnect as a family. The resort was picturesque, nestled along a secluded beach with sparkling waters and sprawling gardens. Mark was determined to make the most of the trip, focusing on his family and leaving work behind. One evening, after dinner at the resort's main restaurant, Mark and Laura sat on the balcony of their suite, sipping wine as the sun dipped below the horizon. "This is nice," Laura said softly, leaning against him. Mark smiled, though his thoughts lingered on their history. "It is," he replied. For a moment, it felt like they were back in the early days of their relationship, before life became complicated. A stranger's stare. The next morning, Mark and Laura took a walk along the beach while Emily and Ben slept in. The air was crisp, and the gentle sound of waves created a soothing backdrop. As they strolled, Mark noticed a man sitting alone at a beachfront cafe. He was around their age, with an athletic build and a confident demeanor. What struck Mark was the way the man was looking at Laura, intense, as though he recognized her. Mark nudged her lightly. "Do you know that guy? He's staring at you." Laura glanced over and froze. Her face drained of color, and she quickly averted her gaze. "No," she said too quickly, her voice tight. "I've never seen him before." Mark frowned, sensing her unease. "You sure?" "Yes, I'm sure," she replied, tugging him forward. "Let's keep walking." The encounter. The following evening, while Mark was at the bar getting drinks, the man approached Laura as she sat near the pool. She looked up, startled, as he smiled at her. Well, if it isn't Laura," he said, his tone dripping with familiarity. "I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong person," she said quickly, her voice wavering. "Don't play coy," the man replied, leaning closer. "It's me, Chris. From Chicago. Ring any bells?" Laura's heart pounded in her chest. Of all the places in the world, she couldn't believe she had run into Chris, the man she had cheated with years ago. "I'm here with my family," she hissed, glancing nervously toward the bar where Mark was waiting. "This isn't the time." Chris chuckled. "Relax. I'm just saying hi. But you should know, I don't forget faces, or anything else." Before Laura could respond, Mark returned with their drinks. He noticed her tense expression and the way Chris smiled at her. "Who's this?" Mark asked, his tone neutral but wary. Chris extended a hand. "Chris. Just a guy passing through." Mark shook his hand reluctantly. "Mark. Nice to meet you. You've got a lovely family," Chris said, his eyes lingering on Laura. "Enjoy your stay." As Chris walked away, Mark turned to Laura. "You looked like you'd seen a ghost. Are you sure you don't know him?" Laura forced a smile. "No, just caught me off guard. Let's not make a big deal out of it." Seeds of doubt. Over the next few days, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He caught Laura glancing nervously over her shoulder, her usual calm demeanor replaced by an air of unease. One afternoon, while Laura was with the kids, Mark ran into Chris near the resort's fitness center. "Hey," Chris said casually, nodding at him. "How's it going?" "Fine," Mark replied, his tone clipped. Chris smirked. "You've got a good thing going." "Laura's quite the catch." Mark's jaw tightened. "You seem to know a lot about my wife." Chris chuckled. "Just making an observation." "Have a good one, Mark." As Chris walked away, Mark felt a knot of suspicion tightening in his chest. An unsettling revelation. That evening, while Laura was showering, Mark's curiosity got the better of him. He unlocked her phone, something he hadn't done in years. At first, he found nothing unusual, texts with friends, photos of the kids, but then he saw an unsaved number with a recent text. "Can we talk? It's Chris." Mark's heart pounded as he stared at the message. He quickly closed the phone and placed it back where he found it, his mind racing. A storm brewing. Mark couldn't sleep that night. He replayed every interaction with Chris and Laura since they arrived at the resort, his mind connecting dots that painted an unsettling picture. The text message he'd found haunted him, its casual tone suggesting a familiarity that Laura had vehemently denied. The next morning, Mark decided to observe rather than confront. He watched Laura closely, noticing how she seemed distracted, her smiles forced and fleeting. At breakfast, Chris walked by their table, offering a casual nod in their direction. Laura stiffened, her gaze fixed on her plate. "Something wrong?" Mark asked, his tone neutral but pointed. Laura forced a laugh. "No, just thinking about what we should do today. Maybe a boat tour?" Mark nodded, hiding his frustration. "Sure. That sounds good." Confronting Chris. Later that afternoon, Mark saw Chris alone at the resort's outdoor bar. Seizing the opportunity, he approached, his demeanor calm but firm. "Chris, right?" Mark said, taking a seat beside him. Chris smirked. "That's me. What can I do for you?" "I need to know how you know my wife," Mark said bluntly, cutting through the pleasantries. Chris took a sip of his drink, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Why don't you ask her?" "I'm asking you," Mark replied, his voice low but steady. Chris leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. "We go way back. Chicago, a few years ago. Let's just say we had a connection." Mark's fists clenched under the table. "What kind of connection?" Chris shrugged, clearly enjoying the tension. "A personal one. But hey, that's all in the past, right?" Mark stood abruptly, his chest tight with anger. "Stay away from my wife." Chris chuckled. "Sure thing, Mark. Enjoy your vacation." The confrontation. That evening, after putting the kids to bed, Mark confronted Laura. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Laura looked up from her book, her expression wary. "About what?" "Chris," Mark replied, his voice heavy with accusation. Her face paled. "Mark, I told you, I don't know him." "Don't lie to me, Laura," he snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "I talked to him. He told me everything." Laura's eyes filled with tears as she stammered, "I didn't want to hurt you again. It was years ago, during that rough patch. It meant nothing." "Nothing?" Mark repeated, his voice shaking with anger. "Then why is he here? Why is he texting you? Why are you acting like a guilty teenager every time he's around?" Laura buried her face in her hands, sobbing. "I didn't know he'd be here. I didn't respond to his messages. I swear, Mark, I haven't done anything wrong since." Mark's voice softened, but his words were cold. "Since you destroyed my trust the first time?" Laura's silence was deafening. The spiral. Over the next few days, the tension between Mark and Laura was palpable. They went through the motions of vacation activities for the sake of Emily and Ben, but the cracks in their facade were obvious. Mark found himself consumed by thoughts of betrayal, not just from years ago but now, in the present. Chris's smug demeanor, Laura's evasiveness, it all pointed to something deeper, something unresolved. One evening, while Laura was helping the kids pack for a day trip, Mark received a text from an unknown number. "You deserve to know the truth. Meet me at the bar, 10 p.m. Chris." Mark stared at the message, his emotions a mix of anger and curiosity. Chris's revelation. At 10 p.m., Mark arrived at the bar, spotting Chris at a secluded table. He approached cautiously, his jaw clenched. "Let's make this quick," Mark said, sitting down. Chris smirked, leaning forward. "I thought you'd want answers. I'm here to give them." "Then talk," Mark snapped. Chris took a slow sip of his drink before speaking. "Laura and I met at a conference in Chicago. She was charming, fun, and, well, lonely. One thing led to another, and, you know how it goes." Mark's stomach churned, but he remained silent. "It wasn't just a one-night thing," Chris continued, relishing Mark's discomfort. "We kept in touch for a few months. She'd tell me how stressed she was, how you were too busy for her. I was a distraction." Mark's fists clenched. "Why are you telling me this now?" Chris shrugged. "Because you deserve to know. And because she never told you the whole story, did she?" Mark stood abruptly, his vision clouded with rage. "Stay away from my family." Chris smirked. "Sure. Whatever you say." Laura's full confession. That night, Mark confronted Laura again, his anger boiling over. "Tell me the truth," he demanded, throwing Chris's words at her. "You didn't just cheat once. It wasn't just a mistake, was it?" Laura's face crumpled as she broke down. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I was lonely, Mark. You were always working, always distracted. I felt invisible." Mark's voice cracked with emotion. "So your solution was to betray me? To lie to me for years?" "I ended it," Laura sobbed. "I knew it was wrong, and I stopped. I tried to fix things with us." Mark shook his head, stepping back as if her words physically repelled him. "You didn't fix anything. You just buried the truth and hoped I'd never find it." Laura reached for him, but he recoiled. "Mark, please. Don't," he said, his voice cold. "I can't even look at you right now." A silent divide. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Mark and Laura barely spoke, their interactions limited to the necessities of parenting Emily and Ben. Mark's mind was a storm of emotions, betrayal, anger, and disappointment swirling together in a relentless loop. Laura tried to breach the wall Mark had built around himself. "Mark," she began one evening as they sat on the balcony, the children asleep inside, "I'm sorry. I don't know how else to say it." Mark didn't look at her. "Sorry doesn't fix what you did. You had years to come clean, and you chose to lie instead." "I didn't want to hurt you," she said softly. Mark turned to her, his expression cold. "You didn't want to hurt yourself. Don't pretend this was about me." Chris's final move. Despite Mark's warnings, Chris hadn't left the situation alone. One afternoon, as Mark sat by the pool watching Emily and Ben play, Chris strolled up, a smug grin on his face. "Mark," he said casually, taking a seat beside him. Mark's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" "I just thought you'd like to know something," Chris said, lowering his voice. "You're not the only one she's lied to." Mark's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Chris leaned in, his tone conspiratorial. "Laura told me she was leaving you." That's why I stuck around. She said she'd already made up her mind. Mark's stomach dropped, though he kept his expression neutral. You're lying. Chris smirked. Believe what you want. But if you're smart, you'll realize you deserve better. Mark stood abruptly, his voice low and dangerous. If I see you near my family again, I won't be responsible for what happens. Chris raised his hands in mock surrender. Relax, man. I'm done here. A breaking point. That night, Mark confronted Laura with Chris's claim. He said you told him you were going to leave me, Mark said, his voice shaking with anger. Is that true? Laura's eyes filled with tears. Mark, I never meant it. I was confused and angry back then. I said things I didn't mean. Mark shook his head, pacing the room. Every time I think I've reached the bottom of this, there's another layer of lies. How am I supposed to believe anything you say? I don't know, Laura admitted, her voice trembling. But I love you, and I want to fix this. Mark stopped, staring at her with a mixture of disbelief and bitterness. Love doesn't look like this, Laura. Seeds of revenge. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Laura hadn't told him everything. Her lies had been too calculated, too deliberate. He began to wonder if Chris's claims about her were true, that she'd considered leaving him and simply changed her mind when it became inconvenient. Fueled by anger, Mark started formulating a plan. If Laura had spent years hiding the truth, she needed to face the consequences. Setting the stage. Mark decided he would confront Laura in a way she wouldn't forget. He began gathering evidence of her affair, printing out old texts and emails he'd recovered from her devices. He also contacted Chris one final time, feigning a desire to hear his side of the story. Chris, eager to get one last jab at Laura, provided Mark with messages from years ago where Laura had expressed doubts about her marriage. Armed with this information, Mark planned his next move. The family gathering. A week after returning from vacation, Mark suggested hosting a family dinner to reset things. Laura, desperate for reconciliation, eagerly agreed. They invited their closest family members, including Mark's sister, Rachel, and Laura's parents. As the group sat around the dining table, Mark stood, raising his glass for a toast. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, he began, his tone deceptively warm. Family means everything to me, and I'm grateful for each of you. Laura smiled nervously, sensing something beneath his words. But, Mark continued, his voice hardening, sometimes family isn't what it seems. Sometimes, the people closest to you betray your trust in ways you never thought possible. The room fell silent. Mark set down his glass and pulled out the folder of evidence he'd prepared. Laura, it's time everyone knows the truth. Mark, don't, Laura began, her face pale. But Mark was relentless. He handed out copies of the messages and emails, his voice steady as he detailed her affair and the lies that followed. Gasps filled the room as Laura's parents stared at her in shock. Rachel glared at her brother-in-law. How could you do this? Rachel demanded. Laura broke down, sobbing as the weight of her secrets came crashing down. Fallout. The fallout from the dinner was immediate. Laura's parents, who had always admired Mark, offered him their support. Rachel, who had never fully trusted Laura, made it clear whose side she was on. Laura, meanwhile, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered reputation. Friends and family distanced themselves, unable to reconcile her betrayal with the person they thought they knew. Mark moved into the guest room, making it clear that their marriage was hanging by a thread. A twist in the plan. As Mark focused on moving forward, he began receiving anonymous emails. They contained vague threats and insinuations, suggesting that someone, likely Chris, wasn't done meddling in their lives. Mark confronted Laura about it, but she denied any involvement. I haven't spoken to him since the vacation, she insisted. Then why is he still trying to get under my skin? Mark demanded. I don't know, Laura said, her voice trembling. But I swear, I'm not talking to him. Mark wasn't sure he believed her. The anonymous threats. The anonymous emails continued, each more unsettling than the last. The messages ranged from veiled insults to outright threats, alluding to Mark's confrontation with Laura. One particularly chilling email read, "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've started. Watch your back." Mark's frustration boiled over. He was certain Chris was behind it, but he needed proof. He contacted a cybersecurity expert, explaining the situation and sharing the emails. "Can you track where these are coming from?" Mark asked. The expert nodded. "Give me a couple of days. If they've slipped up even once, I'll find them." Laura's desperation. Meanwhile, Laura was falling apart. The dinner confrontation had left her isolated, and even her parents, once her staunchest supporters, were distant. One evening, she approached Mark while he was working in the guest room. "Mark, please," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you, but I don't want us to end like this." Mark didn't look up from his laptop. "You should have thought about that before you destroyed our marriage." Tears streamed down Laura's face. "I've lost everything. I can't lose you too." Mark finally met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You didn't lose me, Laura. You threw me away." A break in the case. The cybersecurity expert called Mark 2 days later with an update. "I traced the emails," the expert said. "They're coming from a personal account tied to Chris." Mark wasn't surprised, but hearing it confirmed reignited his anger. "What do I do now?" Mark asked. "That's up to you," the expert replied. "You could report him to the authorities, or you could confront him directly. Either way, you've got the proof." Mark decided to handle it himself. Confronting Chris again. Mark drove to Chris's address, which he had obtained during his earlier investigation. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding. Chris opened it, his smug grin fading when he saw Mark's expression. "We need to talk," Mark said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Chris crossed his arms. "What's this about?" "The emails," Mark said coldly. "I know they're from you." Chris smirked. "So what if they are? You embarrassed her, embarrassed yourself. Someone had to put you in your place." Mark stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "If you send one more message, one more word, I'll make sure your life is as miserable as you tried to make mine. Do you understand?" Chris laughed, but there was an edge of nervousness in his voice. "Fine." Message received. Laura's confession. When Mark returned home, Laura was waiting for him. "Where were you?" she asked. "With Chris," Mark replied bluntly. "He's been sending those emails." Laura's face fell. "I had no idea. I swear." "Doesn't matter," Mark said, brushing past her. "It's over now." Laura followed him into the living room. "Mark, please. I'm trying to make things right." Mark turned to her, his eyes filled with frustration. "You can't undo what you've done, Laura. Stop pretending this is fixable. A new beginning." As the weeks passed, Mark began focusing on himself and his children. He filed for separation, determined to create a stable environment for Emily and Ben. He also reconnected with old friends, finding solace in their support and encouragement. One friend, Julia, who had known him since college, became a particularly strong source of comfort. "You've been through hell," Julia said one evening over coffee. "But you're still standing. That says a lot about you." Laura's redemption arc. Laura, meanwhile, began her own journey of self-reflection. She started therapy, determined to understand why she had made the choices that led to her downfall. "I was selfish," she admitted during one session. I wanted attention, validation, but I didn't think about the consequences. Her therapist nodded. Acknowledging that is an important step. The next is figuring out how to rebuild your life, even if it's not the life you expected. Laura also focused on repairing her relationship with Emily and Ben, using her visitation time to create positive memories and prove her commitment to being a better mother. A final confrontation. Months later, Mark ran into Chris one last time at a networking event. Chris looked disheveled, his once confident demeanor replaced with bitterness. "I hope you're happy," Chris said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Mark smiled faintly. "Happier than you'll ever be." Chris sneered but said nothing more as Mark walked away, leaving the past behind. Moving forward. Mark finalized his divorce from Laura, gaining primary custody of Emily and Ben. He continued to focus on building a new life for himself and his children, finding strength in their bond. His relationship with Julia grew deeper, and while he was cautious about opening his heart again, he found comfort in her honesty and support. One evening, as they watched the sunset together, Julia turned to him. "You deserve to be happy, Mark. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Mark smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Lessons learned. Mark's journey from betrayal to healing was marked by pain, resilience, and self-discovery. While Laura's actions had shattered their marriage, they also taught him the value of self-respect and the importance of moving forward. Laura's path was one of redemption, filled with hard truths and difficult choices, but she found a way to rebuild her life for herself and her children. In the end, both Mark and Laura found their own versions of peace, though their paths no longer intertwined.